Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we'll be examining the political leader who will continue our look at the direct impact of Reconstruction, how it unfolded in the former rebel states. But before we begin our lecture proper, I just like to do a quick recap on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we actually began the process of examining Reconstruction as it unfolded in the former rebel states. We looked at African Americans. We looked at the Free State adventurers, also known as the carpetbaggers, the poor and middling ex-Confederates, and those who later became sympathetic with the plight of the Republicans or the cause of the Republicans in the South, who were deemed scalawags by their contemporaries. And we also looked at the ex-slavocrats, how they had largely been dispirited and how they had lost significant amounts of wealth, but they remained a very formidable foe in the battle over Reconstruction. We also looked at the interesting fact that a number of them simply left the United States rather than submit to living in a land where slavery was abolished. Rather than admit defeat, they simply fled abroad and settled in the last bastion for slavery, Brazil, where they became known as the Confederatos. And it is from that point, it is from there we'll pick up our lectures. We'll dive right back into our lecture series. Now, in the late 1860s, the coalition of Free State adventurers, African Americans, and progressive Southerners came to power in the former slave states. Blanche Bruce, Hiram Revels, they were both slaves who had escaped from slavery and gained an education in the Free States before the war. A majority of the African American politicians were men who achieved freedom before the war, with the exception of Robert Smalls of South Carolina. Smalls was a slave who was impressed into the Confederate Navy. He later seized control of his ship and delivered it to the United States Navy, a feat that won him national prestige, and it also enabled him to sort of leverage that prestige into serving later as a congressman throughout most of the 1870s and late 1880s. A very remarkable man, a very remarkable life and career for Robert Smalls. The African American community made gains at the state, local, state and the local level of politics. A number of positions. They acquired a number of positions in the state legislatures, lieutenant governorships. A number of African American men served as the secretaries of education, the treasurers of the states, the secretaries of states for a number of these former rebel states. They did not acquire any governorships, and they did not really acquire representation commensurate to their population outside of South Carolina. But with that said, more than 600 African American men were elected to state legislatures during Reconstruction. In South Carolina, where African Americans were undoubtedly the majority, they took control of the lower house for a time. These men and their allies set forth an agenda that was nothing short of remarkable. It entailed the radical transformation of the former slave states. Their legislative program can be broken down into three spheres: legal reform, economic modernization, and institution building, or infrastructure building, really. Firstly, the radical Republican governments of the former slave states rewrote their state constitutions. And the main takeaway from these new constitutions was that African American men were enfranchised. The African American community and was really also given a boon because the constitutions also created more offices that were elective rather than appointed. giving them more of an ability to sort of flex their political muscle. Laws were updated to the national consensus. A lot of these southern states, a lot of these slave states, had laws that had not been updated since the colonial era. They really hadn't kept pace with the changes that the republic was making throughout the 19th century. Protections for women were also enacted, such as protecting a married woman's property and making divorce easier. Prior to Reconstruction, divorce had been virtually illegal. The new governments also expanded the economics of their states. Railways were repaired and expanded. New industrial manufacturing enterprises were established and subsidized. New roads were constructed, as well as paving the city's streets. Other improvements included where state hospitals, humane prisons, asylums for the insane and orphans. Some of these state governments also created or tried to create social welfare programs, the likes of which would not be seen in much of the Republic until the late 20th century. South Carolina and Alabama, their Reconstruction governments went as far as offering free medical care and legal counsel to the poor. The government's failings was that they did not integrate these facilities. So you see that while these Reconstruction governments are going out and they're broadly expanding the scope of government services and government duties, they're not really integrating these systems and these facilities, these new additions to what the governments are doing, because they weren't integrated after Reconstruction. It would sort of give rise to the separate but equal philosophy that came to dominate the former rebel states, that the Redeemers sort of ran with. Now, to pay for this broad expansion of state services, new taxes were introduced. And now the new taxes provoked more opposition than anything else. The former slave states had been run by the slavocrats since the inception of the Republic. And the slavocrats were loath to tax themselves. There was a tax on slaves, but not really a tax on much of anything else. And the tax on slaves was never really that high. Now the slavocrats, the way they balanced their budgets was by offering basically no state benefits. There were virtually no state benefits in any of the slave states. To finance their new civic program, the Reconstruction governments passed a series of property taxes. Now, the new taxes affected former slavocrats most, since they still held most of the land and most of the wealth. And this was a calculated move by the Reconstruction governments. It was designed to weaken the economic power of the slavocrats, to have the slavocrats pay their share of rebuilding and modernizing the region, and for the weakening of the slavocrats by having them sell land to the poor, and in the process helping the poor become self-sufficient. The former slavocrats were further incensed because the counties where the bulk of the plantations were situated were African American majority, meaning that the county tax assessor was an African American more often than not. And former slavocrats found themselves being forced to pay new state taxes to their former slaves, a most humiliating ordeal for a number of slavocrats. Now, the presence of African American tax assessors was not unique. In the wake of the arrival of the United States victory, the freedmen population of the former slave states organized themselves into an effective political force by what it was, I want to say 1868, the Union Leagues. And the Union Leagues originated as patriot organizations that followed in the wake of the United States Army's victories. But these Union Leagues, they sort of took on a life of their own in the freedmen community of the former slave states. They soon became community self-help centers. They were used to finance community improvements. The Union Leagues also served to provide a civics education to the freedmen, telling them about their responsibilities as voters, telling them about the responsibilities of elected officials, how government worked. It was literally just a crash course in the operations of the United States government and also the local, state, and county government. The Union Leagues also served as sort of early think tanks on who the community wanted, or who was putting their name forward to be nominated for local, state, and federal level office. Most importantly, the Union League was mainly filled with war veterans, and these war veterans organized militia companies to protect freedmen communities from outsider violence. The day-to-day experience of the freedmen really remained largely the same. A few freedmen went to work in towns, but the vast majority remained in the rural areas where they became agricultural laborers, working for wages on the same old plantation estates that they had labored on as slaves. On the estates, there was a struggle between both groups over wages, over freedmen and slaveocrats over wages and working conditions in the fields. And a number of strikes and work stoppages broke out. And the Urban League, the Union League, I should say, backed up by militia companies, served as the necessary buffer from the violent attempts by strike breakers. The biggest social change during Reconstruction was the introduction of sharecropping. Now, sharecropping is an economic system in which landowners provide access to land for landless laborers in return for working on the land, raising crops that were in turn shared between the landowner and the laborer. Cropping, as it came to be known, provided what was thought to be a reasonable solution to a very difficult issue confronting the region. For cashless, land-rich former slaveocrats, it provided what they needed most, and that was access to labor. And this labor did not have to be paid wages. For freedmen, it gave them a measure of economic security. Croppers, as the laborers were soon known for, provided labor at their own discretion. Freed women, actually at this point, entered the agricultural sphere at the critical junctions in the planting and harvesting cycle. For freedmen, it offered familiar work in a most unfamiliar atmosphere. They now worked at their own pace without direct hostile supervision. There were no threats of separation by sale or beating to spur their production. This was a freedom that they had never really known before. It was always hurry, 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 working at the fastest worker's pace. The fastest worker always working faster and faster to improve their time. Either in planting and harvesting or just providing simple maintenance. The initial impact of sharecropping was a good one. In the immediate post-war years, cotton prices remained high. The returns for the landowner and the cropper were gainful. The fairness of the deals between the two parties were maintained by the presence of friendly elected officials and a standing militia. Now, the situation was prosperous but tenuous at best. Favorable officials were necessary since the landowner offered the equipment necessary for planting, including seeds and tools, against their upcoming crop. Now, the pro-Reconstruction officials ensured that the local authorities and courts provided relief to the cropper when they felt that their landlord was cheating them. Now, the former slaveocrat, who habitually was used to having free range over his labor force, and the local courts bridled under such constraints. Now, this arrangement made the laborer the landowner's partner, not a subordinate. And for former slavocrats, for former slave owners, this was just too much. They now became determined to break the alliance of the freedmen, the free state adventurer, and the progressive Southerners, and reassert their dominance. This was simply a step too far. This was too radical, too revolutionary. And it is here that we'll break in our lecture series, and we'll come back with our next lecture. And as always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know specifically what you thought about this lecture. A lot of people are fascinated with sharecropping. Many people believe that sharecropping should have been instituted from the beginning. And some people believe that sharecropping should still be used today. On paper, sharecropping is an amazing and a very, sort of common sense solution to a lot of agricultural labor problems. But as we'll see in future lectures, the landlords of the croppers, when given the opportunity to abuse the croppers, they did, and that sort of underscores, sort of offset sharecropping. But that's a topic for future lectures. For future lectures, sorry about that. Hit like, subscribe, comment, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.